today with this. So if you would, go ahead and pull up the Droid Cafe theme project, and we'll start from there.
Are we moving this to 5.2?
Just keep this in 5.1. We're doing things a little bit out of order because the stuff we're going to talk about today is technically covered in 5.3. And then we'll talk about 5.2 in on Thursday. So to just keep it straight, I'm going to keep everything in 5.1 rather than trying to go through them out of order. Okay.
Yep.
So pull up that project. Okay, so what we're going to be working with today is talking about how to take this application and translate it over into Spanish. That's our goal, right? So to take this app that we've already built and figure out how to get it into another language. Part of what that'll illuminate is kind of why we've been doing the strings XML file throughout the semester. I believe you got introduced into this idea of extracting your strings, and you really need to extract your strings like week 2 of this course. But oddly enough, they wait until 5.3, at least this textbook does, to tell you why you're doing that. Why are you extracting the strings, and why is that important? So, what we're going to be doing, the reason why we did that from the beginning is to get prepared for being able to translate this into other languages. And that's really important in the world of Android, in the mobile market. Because if you say, I'm only going to target English speakers, or I'm only going to target the US, for most apps, you're losing a very sizable amount of your available customer base, right? The amount of demand for having your app in every language available is really high, and oftentimes you need that just for your app to be really marketable, or to make it on the market, because of just a bunch of market drivers, including the fact that cost of apps, users expect them to be super cheap, which but they're not necessarily the easiest to make. They're not, cheap to make. So you have to be able to reach a larger global base in order for them to really make money a lot of times. And the other, just the other side of that is, there's a lot of benefits to having a kind of a global app, a global audience on most apps. Now, let's say maybe you're building an app for just a local coffee shop or local restaurant. That may not be as important to you. You still probably should translate at least into Spanish, because we still have Spanish speakers locally. But for most apps, you're going to be talking to or trying to reach a global audience. Okay, so you have to kind of think about that as you're building the application. Okay, everybody with me so far on the wheres and whys of this? So, good news is we're not going to be writing a whole lot of code today, just because it really doesn't take that much code to do what we need to do. I will say that there are parts of this app that won't be translated, and we'll kind of talk about the wheres and whys and maybe how that could be done. But what we're going to translate is part of the app, but not the whole thing. And again, we'll get into how that fits in and where that goes. So the first thing we probably want to do before we make any changes to our apps is to just kind of go look at, well, what does this look like right now if I install it in, say, a phone that is set to Spanish? Let's see what that looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the home screen, right? And actually, I can leave my app running. I don't need to shut it down. So I'm going to start that back up. But I'm going to go wait for it to start up again. Did it actually run? Because it doesn't appear to be running. Oh, because I have another emulator running, and it's trying to run on my 7-inch emulator over on my other screen. That's why. Okay, so running it on the Nexus S. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to just leave and go into Settings. So we're going to scroll down in Settings. We're going to go find System here. This may be categorized a little bit different on your Samsung devices. Every operating system, every kind of manufacturer puts it in a different place. But on here, it's under System, and it's going to be under Languages. So you should get to a screen, Languages. You should get to a screen that looks like this. Has everybody found that screen?
Do you want us to follow along or just watch?
I do want you to follow along with this. Make sure you know how to find this on the physical device.
I'm not sure if I found the right place. I got a bunch of radio buttons that can choose the language, with the top one being use system language.
Then that would be the wrong place. So it should look like this, I believe. Might take a double check.
Yeah, I got it. I figured it out.
Okay. So does it look like this now on the screen that you're on?
Yeah.
Okay. So everybody else got the screen as well? You hear?
Yep.
Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit Add Language first. And you can see there's a bunch of languages listed. We could scroll all the way down to find Spanish. Good news is it's actually suggesting it here on the top. So you'll see it's Español, Spanish, Estados Unidos, short for, that's United States. So one of the things to recognize here is we're not actually just picking a language. We're picking what we call is a locale. And a locale is a combination of the language and the country. So, for instance, with Spanish, Spanish isn't necessarily universal globally. There's a few different flavors of Spanish. And so Android recognizes that and registers those as different locales. And that means that you can do a different translation for, say, Spanish Spain or Spanish Mexico or Spanish US. You can have different variants there. Or you can have a United States English and a British English and have those be slightly different translations. So that's why you're seeing that in the parentheses. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Español. There it is. And you may notice, okay, so we have both of these languages here. So the order that it's showing here is basically an order of preference. So you can say, I have multiple languages that I'm willing to use my device in, use the one that's highest in terms of what's available. Okay, so in here right now it's English as my top preference and Spanish as my secondary preference. If I leave this as is, we're still going to see the application in English because English is first. So if I want to get the device actually to go over Spanish, I just need to take this, drag it up to the top, and it should convert the whole the whole device over into Spanish. All right. Everybody got your devices in Spanish now.
Yeah.
And obviously remember how to get here because the system settings are now in Spanish, as you might notice. It's not just your app that's going to be in Spanish. So I'm going to go back to my device, and because we haven't done anything yet, it's still appearing in English, right? So if you ship it as is here, regardless of who installs it, it's going to be in English, right? Which is not what we're going for. But if that's all you're doing, if you're saying, maybe we have an app that only targets one locale because it's just a local thing, then you might set it up that way as just a single strings XML. That would be your default language. Okay? So what we're going to do, and we've kind of seen this before, is we've got one strings XML. We need to create another one, or what we would say another variant of strings XML. So pulling up strings XML, you can kind of see, okay, we've got a bunch of strings and things that are in there. I'm going to right-click on values, and I'm going to say new values resource file. Okay. In here, the name of the file is going to be strings. Okay, so because we've named the file strings, we need to call it strings as well. If we had called it string, then we need to call it string. It needs to match the file name exactly as with any layout variant. So the thing that we want to specify in here, there's all these qualifiers, basically conditions for when to use that particular resource file. So we've seen some of these already. We've talked a little bit about layout direction and small screen width, screen height. We've talked about some orientation, some of the already. What we want to pick here is going to be locale. Okay, there's not just a setting for language, as locale is that combination of language plus country. So let's say I want to put this into Spanish. What I need to do is I need to go down to the E's and look for ES. ES is the designated kind of two-letter thing for Spanish. English is, as you can see, EN. So you have to kind of look that up. Oftentimes those two-letter abbreviations are in the language itself, so it may not necessarily be the first two letters, at least for us in English.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So Spanish is in several places.
Yes.
How would it be different between them? Is it just come down to currency mostly? Is that what the difference is?
Currency can be one reason. That's a very common reason where you may need to do something different, is because of currency. But there also are just different, what do we call it, dialect differences between one country to another, where they might use a slightly different word for something. So, several languages have this. German is one of these that also has that. For instance, the variant of the flavor of German that's spoken in Switzerland versus the flavor of German in Germany is not the same. So oftentimes you'll find that it's kind of localized, and maybe a few words are different from like the Mexican Spanish versus the United States Spanish or the Spain Spanish. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's differences in dialect is what it's there to account for. So what we're going to be doing today is we're just going to be doing it as any region. Again, if you wanted to have multiple variants there, you might have one that's, English Spain and another one that's English Mexico, and I would pick that combination here. So for instance, you can see if I'm doing Dominican Republic, you see the directory name becomes values ES RDO. So it's a combination of both the region code and the language code. But if I say any region, it's just values ES. It's just the language code. So that's really the only gotcha to know with with setting this up is you have to add a locale for Spanish. And hit OK on that. And we'll have a brand new empty file here. So just like we've had with some of the other files, like we've got a colors, we've got basically a default and a night. For dimensions, we've got a default with 600, width 900. We now have a strings XML, right, which is our default language. In this case, our default language is English. And so we've got an English translation there. And then for Spanish, we've got an additional translation file. Okay. So if I try to run the app in this state right now, where nothing else has been done, you'll see it runs, but it uses all of the existing translations, right? All of those existing pieces of text are used. If you don't specify a translation for that, then it will go ahead and just use the default string. Now, as I start going through here, you may notice that some of these things start turning red because it's saying, well, you haven't translated that to Spanish. So where we need to go is effectively we need to translate each of these things one by one. So let me just say, I'm going to take the application name and bring that over. Say Droid Cafe, bring that over here, and we'll come back and translate it in a minute. As soon as I bring that first string over, you'll notice that all of these turn red. Everybody see that?
Yep.
So it's telling me that I haven't translated that string, right? So the end goal is that everything in strings XML needs to have a translation in every one of your translation files. So usually the way I start this is I just take the entire contents of string XML and begin by just copying it over. Because I'm going to end up having all of those there. With a few gotchas. Namely that we've been working on this app and it's changed over time. There are a few strings in strings XML that are no longer in use. Like we had them in the application at some point, but as we iterated, and especially when we went through and we put the recycler view in, some of these went away. Okay. So what I know, having done some research with this, I know that title text here on line 4, I know that is no longer used. Droid desserts, that used to be our title up here. And I also noticed that these 3 toasts here for froyo, cart and sandwich and donut, all of those are no more as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just go control/ comment those out. Because there's no point in translating the things that are no longer being used by the application. Everybody with me there? So as you go through this, you may find that there are some strings that you need to clean up and get rid of because they're no longer in the application. Okay?
You're doing it on both sides or just a new one? You're
I'm
original.
editing the original right now to pull those out. And I was going to do that on both sides.
Why not just delete them?
That's a good question. Why don't we just delete them? The only reason I had commented them out instead is to just make sure everybody can see what I'm deleting. So yes, realistically, go ahead and delete them. Go ahead and delete them on your end. The only reason I'm commenting them out is so you can see what you need to delete. Okay? So let's start at the top. So back in, make sure you're in the ES strings XML file. What we want to do is go through each of these one by one and do a translation. Okay. So I'm going to pull up my web browser. And I'm going to say Google Translate. you'll see this kind of pop up. I'm going to go ahead and hit open in Google Translate. That will actually take me over to the Translate app, which is going to give me some more information. So over in here, I'm going to pick English as my source, Spanish as my destination. I'll share that link here so that everybody's on the same page. And that's with English and Spanish pre-selected. So what I'm going to do is I need to go through each of these pieces one by one, each of these strings one by one, and make a translation. So we kind of start at the top. I can take Droid Cafe, paste that in. Obviously Google Translate's not going to give us a perfect good translation for a lot of these things, but at least give us a starting point. Now you may notice when I put Droid Cafe in there, it looks like I'm getting the same string on both sides. That's actually a sign that the Google Translate is not working. It should be translating this, but it isn't, right? So what can I do to get a translation out for Droid Cafe?
Could you maybe just type in Droid first and then Cafe afterwards? That way it's not looking more like...
Okay, that's a good thing to try. So that's a good thing to try. And that gives me something. There's a catch here, though. Droid is actually an abbreviation. It's not the full word, right? Which is part of what's tripping it up, right? What is Droid short for? Android. So if I want to translate this properly, that's actually the wrong. Droid is the wrong word to put in. Android is what I want to translate. So I'm going to grab that in there. And yeah, you're right, Jonathan. Sometimes you get a different translation based on whether or not you make it uppercase. But here I'm going to go Android. So that's the word I'm going to pull over. And then, cafe. Let's try, as you were saying, let's try to do these as separate. Cafeteria. Okay. Well, that makes sense. So Android, cafeteria. So sometimes as you're kind of playing with this, you may have to put in word piecemeal to get a good translation out.
I don't know, but for Android, like when I put Android instead of Droid,
yep,
it says Android Cafe, but it doesn't, because I think since wouldn't Android, since it's a name brand, wouldn't you want to keep it spelled the same?
I would not think so. I mean, I could be totally wrong with that. But obviously the word cafe needs to be translated one way or the other.
Yeah.
So I'm not an expert on Spanish. So I don't know what the right translation is. It may be Androida cafeteria. It might be this. I do notice that there's a little mark on there, so that may be a closer translation. Sometimes with Google, it's hard to know for sure with Google Translate. So, just so we're clear, this is a quick and dirty way to do this. If you're going to take Google Translate and translate your text, you shouldn't just release that out. This is like, hey, let's get a version to see if it works and see if our layouts work, and then we'll pay a translator to do an actual translation. Does that make sense? So there actually is a way, once you've deployed your apps, the Google Play Console, where you actually publish the app, does have a way for you can say, I want to request my app to be translated. And so basically it gives them a way to provide you an updated strings XML file with better translations. Okay? So this is just a quick and dirty translation. So let's go with the next one. So donut text. Put that in, translate it over. Now, one of the things you'll notice there, I kind of missed a typo earlier, and Google Translate kind of caught it in the process. So like if I go back to my English, you'll notice I was missing an L there, and it was underlined as being kind of a a typo. So you may find you may have to watch out for those as well, typos as you're doing your translation, because the typos will throw off your translation. So let's bring that in. Again, we're back in the world of Spanish. I'm going to do the ice cream description here. Bring that in. So a lot of the kind of the translation work is just kind of doing this kind of one by one to get a translation out. Okay. Place order. Let's pull that over. And so I'm going to copy that. Delivery date. And, this is kind of some of the areas where you see, oh, well, maybe things, in your layout may need to change because, okay, well, delivery date is a little bit longer and delivery time is even longer still, right? So what was pretty short, that's gotten pretty long. Everybody with me there, kind of seeing some of that. So, oftentimes this may then necessitate going back to the layout and rethinking how you maybe have the layout structured, because this might change how things fit. So going through there, if we think about the time format, well, do I need to translate the time format? Yeah, probably not, right? But that is still in here because, as we talked about, there's differences in locale. So one part of the world may format their times one way, another part of the world might format their dates another way. So by having this here, potentially, if I wanted to do this as, say, a 24-hour clock, I could just change this to HHMM, and now, at least theoretically, things should be working in a 24-hour sort of display string there. I'm going to go back to my 12-hour string. Okay. Same thing with the date. Let's say you wanted to flip it around and have it date month and year, or month, date, year. You can do that here if that would be necessary for the particular place that you're translating it into. I'm going to go to action order. I'm going to translate that. Orden status estado. Favorites. Now, some of these you may run into kind of some interesting things, right? So favorites, notice that it has two possible translations. Everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Because you have a feminine and a masculine version in Espanol.
Okay. And that exists for quite a few words, right? And so which of those translations should I use?
It's the masculine, isn't it? Is the more prominent.
Okay. Why is it, if you're picking if you're picking the feminine versus the masculine, is it the speaker that determines the gender, or is it who you're speaking to?
It's usually about who you're speaking to. Like if you're speaking to a girl, it's niña versus niño.
So how do you know that the user of this application is female or male?
You don't. So do you have to make it more universal?
Yeah. So that can be a common problem, right? Honestly, the Google Android system for translation does not provide a solution for that. There's not a way to say, here's the masculine form of the translation and here's the feminine form of the translation. Because realistically, that affects more words than just this one. Does that make sense? So this is one of those places where translation gets hard. And doing it properly is a difficult thing, because in reality we would like it to be able to switch between the feminine and the masculine depending on who's using it. But that also then would necessitate putting somewhere in the app where we ask them. Does that make sense? Like, you may need either a setting to change the gender, or you may need some sort of essentially registration or setup when you start the app for the first time. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
A lot of Norwegian languages have similar problems where there's different kind of things that in the language that change based on who you're talking to. So that's kind of one of the open questions in terms of which one should you translate it as and how to properly handle that. Okay. So for this example here, what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to grab the feminine forms of all the translations. So I'm going to say favoritas here. I'm going to go down to contact. Next one. But you also notice here, right? So contacto, it only gives me one translation. But looking back at that same one, I know that traditionally with Spanish, that last letter usually has some connotation of the particular gender, right? And I don't know if that applies to this word, but I would assume that, not knowing Spanish well, would it be contacta if we were talking to, would that be the feminine form of that word?
It depends on the context. I can't remember what it was. It's contact details, right?
I think so. Mm-hmm.
Datos de contacto.
Where are you looking at that?
Oh, I just know it from music.
Okay.
Contact details. That's what it would be.
Is that what you said? Datos de contacto?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So, there are things like that, oftentimes, and this is often where you have to get a translator involved, is because if you just feed it in here, right, it can't tell you some of those things, right? So oftentimes you have to kind of go through and actually get somebody involved that knows the language a little bit better. So kind of continuing to go through product detail, translate over there, shopping cart. Now, with subtotal, you'll notice that, remember, there's this part of the string, $%s. That part we don't really want translated. So I do have to be careful as I do this to make sure I keep that part untranslated. Okay, so I'm just going to put in the one part of that we actually want translated.
What does it hurt if you just put that in there? It's just the same thing, right?
Well, Google Translate doesn't know how to deal with it. So if I were to put that in here, it's, look at how it comes through. It's trying to translate that portion of it and failing.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah, and so there's some additional hints that you can put in here for in terms of translating that tell Google or tell potentially a translator that it shouldn't be translated, but that's beyond the scope of what we really can talk about today. But there's some additional characters that you can put in to give it give it a better hint on those kind of things. But you do have to watch, as you have those format strings, you've got to recognize that amount in dollars is going there, but it doesn't know that, so it may or may not be able to translate that correctly. And then I'm going to go down to personal. Copy that. That comes out the same way. Work comes out as trabaja, and other same way. We've got 2 possible translations, so I'm just gonna, for this purpose, I'm just gonna pick the feminine version of it. And then if you look at the quantities, well, quantities don't really change. It's just a number from 1 to 6, so we can leave those as is. Okay. Any questions so far?
It's about the easiest thing I've seen.
Yeah. This is I would say that this is, although there's some gaps, like, how do you deal with genders in Spanish? They have Android's got a really strong translation system built in. And so that can make this a lot easier than, say, translating a website where there's not as something that's so fundamental built into the framework. So, okay, so we've got Android Cafe. We've got that showing up properly. If I look up the menu, okay, all of those things look right. But what we want to kind of check is look at, well, where are those areas? Once we've done all this translation, we need to be looking for where are those areas where it's still appearing in English. And we also need to be watching for places where the layout appears to be broken. So is there anywhere, let's kind of start with the first screen, starting with main activity. Is there anything that's still appearing in English? And so, yeah, the obvious answer is this, right? Why is this text here appearing in English instead of Spanish?
Does it have something to do with the recycler view?
Okay, maybe. Product data source. You're right. So that's the place we're going to go look and look at what our data looks like. So going over to product data source, you remember that we hard-coded those strings in, right? We hard-coded those strings in. I did that intentionally, partly so that we would see this behavior here. The other reason is, as we kind of move forward, recognize that these strings, like the name of the product, the description, it's not going to be something your app really generally knows ahead of time. Generally, that data is going to be coming from outside of the application. Does that follow? Like, it's probably going to be stored on a database somewhere that is not in your application. So the translation system that's provided here with the resource files only applies and only works with strings that are actually part of your application, right? Where the labels and the controls, those know ahead of time. Everybody with me there? So say I wanted to provide a translation of that data into Spanish. What are my options? What could I do? Kind of using the tools that you have already, between things we talked about last semester, things we talked about, this semester.
I would think you'd have to have a duplicate list and do an
Okay.
if the system locale is U.S. Spanish, use this.
Okay.
Otherwise, use this, something like that. Or a case if you got more than two.
So just to illustrate a problem there, with that approach, you can just go grab the string here. Let's say I have two lists, and then in the English one it says the price of the donut is $3.99, but it's $2.99 if you're in the Spanish language. Is that a problem?
You mean inconsistency in the data, just
You could
by
have
a mistake.
inconsistency on the data. So you shouldn't take that approach, because if you're saying here's a copy of the objects in this other language, in one language, and then I have another list, right? So I have English products and Spanish products, I'm going to get an inconsistency in the data somewhere, right? Because it doesn't enforce any sort of consistency. Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah, I get what you
right.
mean there.
Okay, so that's not really a solution. What's a related solution though that I could do? Could I maybe just change would it be okay if I just changed the data here and just made it in Spanish?
Probably not.
Because, I mean, it shows up in Spanish now.
But the rest of it's in English.
Just because I haven't translated those yet.
The price is still off.
What do you mean the price is still off?
When you want the price to be based on the locale.
No. I would want the price to be based on... I need the price to be based on the currency of the seller is actually typically how you need to do it. Because otherwise, if I say, for instance, let's show this in Canadian dollars, right? Then I have to have in my app an accurate conversion from American dollars to Canadian dollars. And suffice to say, that is not an easy thing to do. So we usually reserve that conversion for checkout. Okay? Does that help? But what's the problem here? Right? Donut is now in Spanish, right? What happens if I go over and go back to English? Well, donut's still in Spanish. Everybody follow with me there? So this data here doesn't change based on the language. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's the problem. Is this data doesn't change based on the language. So, how I deal with data and translating data is not the same way I deal with translating other forms of text, right? So, there's a few different ways I could solve this. One way is that I could potentially add in here. Well, here's the English description. Let's just add another field, which is the Spanish translation. So in my data, I maybe have translations for multiple languages. Does that make sense? And so anytime I want to say, anytime I get a product from the database, I'm getting the product in all of the languages available. Does that make sense? So that's one way to solve it, is to put all of the translations into the data itself. all the different variations of it. And that's one way that a lot of websites kind of a lot of APIs choose to approach the problem. Another way that you can approach the problem is you can say, well, on the server side, maybe when I ask for the data, maybe when my app asks my server for data, I will have my server return it in the proper language. So maybe when I ask for the data, I have to tell the server what locale I'm in. And then the server will provide it to me strictly in the locale that I asked for. Does that make sense? So, this is an issue that basically has to be handled oftentimes on the back end in the database and the server that your actual application is connected to. Does that make sense? So that part, the part of translating the data, is not something I'm asking you to do. Does that make sense in your applications at this point? Everybody with me there?
Yep.
So when I say translate your apps into Spanish, I don't mean that you need to translate the data of the app into Spanish. You just need to translate the static text portions of it. So if you're looking at your menu, or you're making a restaurant or a store that has products, it's okay for me for this assignment if this data here still is in English. That's fine, because the translation of that is a larger question which we're not able to really answer right now. What we're doing is doing the other things around the edges. Okay. Now, if you've explored the app a little bit more, you may have found that there's another place on this screen where things are still appearing in English. Can anybody spot that? There's another place on the screen, which is not this, where we're seeing English text.
Is it in the menu?
Okay.
Okay, not.
It's not a Android, is it? Maybe I had an E on the end of my Android.
So watch this. You're right to suggest the menu. Problem is you didn't dig far enough. So I'm going to go click on the actual item. Look at the toast that shows up. Everybody see that? It says status. Favorites. What happened here? Why are those toasts showing up in English?
Because they're hard-coded in.
Okay. They're hard-coded in what file?
Probably one of the menu files.
Okay. So do some digging and see if you can find it. Anybody? See if you can dig and find this. Common problem that you run into. As you're testing your app, you're going to find out that there are some places where, hey, something didn't get translated.
Well, that's in our main activity.
Okay. Under main activity, can you give me a line number?
Mine's on line 66, but it's on the on options items selected.
That sounds right. So I'm going to go look there. And so main activity, line 66. And you're correct, right? So here it says status, here it says favorites, and here it says contact, right? So the problem is that we never extracted those strings, basically. We had hard-coded those things in. The good news is you notice that we've already translated those three strings, right? So I don't need to extract that string again. I just need to use the translation that we have already provided. Everybody with me there? So you do want to be careful about not creating additional work for yourself by extracting a string that you've already done. So rather than going here and doing Alt-Enter and extracting it like we normally would do, I'm just going to change it to point to the existing string, which I know is rstring action status, right? That's the same string that appears here. And so I can just use rstring dot action favorites or string action contact. So you're going to find that a lot of times the places where you're most, a lot of times the place where you're most likely to catch something that isn't translated is as you're using the app. As you're actually exercising and pressing the buttons. So oftentimes you won't find all of the translation errors just by saying, well, hey, let's look at this. You may actually have to click on some buttons, click on some menu items, and see what's going on. Okay, so as you're testing and you're translating your app into Spanish, make sure to exercise all the functionality. Everybody with me there? Because those are the kind of things that are easy to overlook. So, any questions on how I've kind of done that conversion here? Just switching it over to rstring, etc.
Pretty easy.
Okay. So that's good. Let's kind of keep going through the app. So let's say I go to Donut. And okay, so this screen looks good. There's no menu to check. So let's just try the button and see what happens. Okay, well that takes us over here. All right, so this part looks good. Change the quantities. All of that makes sense. We've got the proper text here. And this text looks like it's in Spanish. Okay, let's go ahead and try the next screen. Uh-oh. Something went wrong, right? Why is this screen in English? Why are we seeing that order activity in English? What file do I need to go and change?
I mean, probably something with order activity.
That sounds reasonable. And so maybe I'll go look at activity order and wait for that to load up. And then I go look at maybe the code view and say, okay, well, let's go translate things. Only to find out it isn't there, right? So, yeah, you're right, Troy, in that we haven't extracted stuff. But you're also, Vincent, you're also correct in the fact that it's not in this file. So, because remember, we broke out the main content of activity order over into the content order file. So that's where I actually need to go. Is I need to go to content order and extract the strings there. So I'm going to go in here, and we can actually see that a lot of these things are red. So kind of starting with the labels from the top to bottom, I want to extract those things. So here with the name, I'm going to say extract, and maybe extract this as name label. Okay. Under address, I'm going to extract this as my address label. I'm going to extract this as phone label. Email label.
And does this put a This is a new string resource. It automatically puts it in both files?
No, it doesn't. We'll get to that. It does not.
You can do that. It gives you the option. The checkbox is there. Yeah?
Oh, you're right. You're right. I was forgetting that. So Alt-Enter, extract string resource. Yes, it gives me the option. I could put it into both files, but it would put the same text into both files.
Yeah,
like
you would put it as and fix it.
You would put it as English. So I'm just going to leave it as just the default version right now, and I'll come back and fix it because my feeling is that doesn't really save a lot of work to do it that way. To check both boxes there. So I'm just going to do the one. And so this would be the delivery method label. Going down here, we have, this is same day delivery.
You have a typo there.
Oh, you're right, I do. I'll go fix it in the string. Extract string resource, next day delivery. And this one's going to be pickup delivery. So yeah, I do have a typo in there. So now that I've extracted all those things, I'm going to go in here, and you'll see these are all red. They're all red because of... Well, that's interesting. I think I did something because this should not be in Spanish right here. That should be add to cart. So did I get... Yes, I translated that into the wrong file. So add to cart should be... What was the translation there? Okay. So fix add to cart real quick. So it's add to cart, and the other one. So you'll see all the ones that we've extracted now. They're in red because there's no equivalent to it in the other file. Does that make sense?
In our Spanish file.
In our Spanish file. So it's warning us that, hey, you have this, you have a translation here, but you don't have it converted. I can fix my typo real quick here. It's kind of highlighting it. So if I were to try the app and maybe see, let's say maybe I put it in the Play Store in this state. Because it actually didn't used to tell us that there's a warning. This is actually a relatively new add to Android Studio because historically you could push an app out and not know that there was a translation missing. Because the app still runs even with it not there. But as you can see, if I go to the order, it's still appearing in English, right? So your app will always fall back to the default file looking for translations. Okay. So one of the mistakes sometimes people make is they say, well, let's make a strings XML EN and we'll make a strings XML ES, but there's no default file, right? And so if you ship it that way, it will crash if there's even just one translation that doesn't appear in both files. The whole app will crash. So that's where we want to make sure that we always have a default file, right, with no qualifier on it. Does that make sense? That means that the app will still run. It just means that some things will be in English instead of Spanish. All right, so we've gotten those parts and we know what we need to translate. So we just need to translate those additional strings which we extracted. And so I'm going to start by just copying and pasting the ones over into the Spanish file, and then I would just go through them one by one. here. Copy that over. And then I can get back to here, right? So now everything should be, oh, except for, I did the same thing with the contact types. I put it into the wrong file. So I need to switch that around. And so that's that's an easy mistake to make, is to accidentally put your translations into the wrong file. Especially since they have very similar names. But okay. So that should be, yep. Okay. All right. So do we have everything? Do we have everything converted over to Spanish?
No.
What's not converted?
The dialog pop-up on purchase.
Okay. So what part of that do we need to convert?
The title, the message, and the actions.
Okay. Title, message, and the actions. Okay. So what file would that be in? Is this a resource file? Is this a code file? Okay, so it's an activity. Which activity specifically? Be order activity, correct. Yeah, so we're going to go look in order activity, and if we kind of look down and look into, where do we pop that dialog back? So here it is, right. So in on by, I need to kind of rework the parts of that where I'm seeing the different text. So I can see on line 174, right? So I've got that click OK to confirm the purchase or cancel to abort. And I may want to extract that one first. So that's going to be kind of what we've done already. Alt Enter, extract or string resource. And this is going to be okay, or this would be purchase confirm text, maybe? There's a lot of different ways to call that. So I'm going to call that purchase confirm text. You'll see it goes ahead and puts a call to get string in there, which we need. And on the title, purchase confirm title, yep, and this would be alt enter extract string resource purchase confirm. Okay. And the other one would be here, alt enter, purchase, confirm, cancel. Okay, so that should give us another 4 new strings back in our strings XML file. And so we just need to go through and translate those as well. And let's see. There they are. So I want to pull in those 4 over to the Spanish and just convert those one by one. Now, you'll remember that we've got kind of a /n in here. If I put that into Google Translate, just like we were talking about the other things, Google Translate won't necessarily know how to deal with the /n. And in reality, I would say you probably want to keep this /n out of the translation, out of the strings XML file, because it's really not really part of the text you want to translate anyway. So I would say let's pull that /n out. And so rather than putting the /n directly in here as it was, what I would do is I would just go back in here and chain two appends together. So I'd say receipt.append /n and then append getString. And so that way the /n is not in there in the translation. Oh, I think I pressed the wrong button. So that's just one thing to know with String Builder, that you can oftentimes do these appends. I've already done that up here kind of for that same reason, that I want that /n to be kind of part of the code instead of being in there. Now, I can use single quotes there if I want to, because it's a single character, not multiple characters, but either way it will work. And just slightly faster if you put single quotes. Let's see. I still need to translate those strings. So back in here, so I've translated the one, which was the confirmed text, and I need to translate the title. I need to translate OK, which comes out the same. Cancel comes out slightly differently. So, doing the actual translation isn't really, overall, is really not a hard process. A lot of it just comes down to, being diligent on testing everywhere, making sure that there is no place in the app where it's still in English, which that email text is suspicious. Yes, because I put the translation into the wrong place. There we go. As I put that in as the note instead of the email. There we go. Okay. So I think we have, let's see, if I hit OK on this, there's still that one text confirmed. Let me track that down.
Both of them are in
Yeah.
order activity still, yeah.
So we still need to change both of those. So Alt-Enter, extract resource, purchase, toast, confirmed, and maybe I'll call this one purchase toast canceled.
It really gets confusing with all these string resources. At first, it doesn't seem to matter, but honestly, with some of them, when I look at them, I really don't know where they're at anymore, like where it appears.
Right. Yeah. Once you look at it, it's like there's all of these different strings you've got. It's like, okay, so where does that appear in my application? And so that's where oftentimes, like, as you see me going through this, I have some naming conventions that I follow, and I try to put a lot more words in there than necessarily are in the actual text that I'm translating, because that helps me track down and remember where it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like rather than just calling this purchase, I call this purchase confirmed title, because then I can go, oh yeah, the purchase confirmed dialog. I know where that is, right? And so, having good naming can be a really big help to also kind of figuring out where things are, right? It's not just having good naming doesn't solve the whole problem. Oftentimes, honestly, I will go back and organize this file because, as you saw, as we're putting these things in, it just adds them to the end, to the end, to the end, to the end, which usually doesn't leave you in a very organized situation. So I'll oftentimes kind of take these and group them together, so I can see, okay, well, these screens, all of these strings go with this, and all these strings go with that. So I might say, well, these strings, I know that I had to add these for the order dialog. So I might put a comment in here. And so the XML form of comment looks like this. It's just the same as HTML, where you have a less than, exclamation mark, dash, dash. And then at the end, you have a dash, dash, greater than. So this would be like the order activity, I know is where all this stuff is for. And this would be the purchase confirmation dialog. So it can be very helpful to go back in and add some comments and kind of group them together so that you know where they appear in the application. Cool? Okay, welcome back. Any outstanding questions? Okay. People here back from break. Oh, I see Jonathan's typing. Cool. I don't think there is, not that I'm aware of, but what you can do is, as I kind of mentioned, you can get into the developer console once you actually deploy an app. And I believe that the developer console for like Google Play console does provide a way to do an auto translate using Google Translate. So I think once you get it onto the App Store, I believe there is an auto translate button. Long story short. But I don't think there's an auto translate button built into Android Studio itself. Yes. Yeah. Every language that you want the app to be available in, you're going to have to go through that process. The good news is, in theory, all you have to change is strings.xml. Just provide it for another language, but because a lot of the other work that we did of like extracting string resources or figuring out that the dialogue wasn't translated as just a one-time thing, versus those other things, these would be for every little language. And so yeah, you may very well, if you have a large-scale app, you may have 100, 200 translations in here. That's not unheard of. And in one of the apps that I worked on professionally, that was the case. We had it in like 100 different languages.
Yeah, but Mr. Schmidt, don't you just hire a translator? How much is a translator, though?
That varies. Again, I would look at the Google Play console to see what those prices are. I believe it's sort of a bidding system. I don't know that there's a fixed standard rate. There's also for dedicated certain industries. There are like dedicated people that do and companies that do that as a job. So, for instance, we worked in the medical industry. We actually paid a company to do that every time we needed the app translated into another language. I don't know how much that costs, though.
For me, I would have thought that translating it would have been as simple as setting it to follow system settings, like we did with the night theme, because if the system itself can translate, why wouldn't it be able to put into the app, you know?
Right. The problem is that Google Translate's not perfect, right? The problem is that Google Translate in many cases is not good enough to just do it, if that makes sense. So that's where, basically you want a human involved to go check that it's correct.
Yeah, but like when you set the settings for the Android phone itself,
yes,
all of the setting, all the names, like the design or display, that's automatically changed. That's what I'm referring to, like the system itself.
Yeah.
But is that using Google Translate?
No, that's not using Google Translate. That is, say you have a Samsung phone, right, your Samsung tablet. Samsung has translated it into all of the languages on that list. That means that on your phone, in the operating system itself, there are hundreds of translations of all that text. Like, all of that is already baked into the device and has been hand translated.
I see.
So basically, like the strings that, like the XML thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because in fact, every app on Android is an app, just like the apps that you're writing. So, like the settings app is written in Java, right? The settings app is written with the same thing, so it's using strings XML just like you're using strings XML to do its translations. So, yeah, but I would say yes, Google Translate is getting better. It's not foolproof, but it is getting better. So it's getting closer to a point where you can just say, hey, take my strings XML, feed it in, and just spit it out, and it will be pretty good. But it's still generally worth it for you to go ahead and hire somebody to do it. The problem is regardless of how good Translate gets, it doesn't understand cultural things, right? And so there's a lot of places where the word translates literally, but there's a context or a connotation thing that you need to understand. So, like, for instance, I think, what was it, Nova? They which is a local, a car. They took that and took it to say Mexico, and so Nova in Spanish means no run, and so that you needed more than just here's the word from the take the word from one language to another. You kind of need to understand and sometimes change more than just a literal translation of it. The other side of things is sometimes, you go from one language to another and something goes from 1 words to 5, whereas if you put a human into that mix, they would translate it as just 1 word rather than a longer sentence. So,
is there usually just like one developer or something that works with the translator or something?
There can be. I would say oftentimes that work gets farmed out. Actually, not to a lot of that gets done by non-developers. I would say is usually that work is managed by. From the developer standpoint, you just say, "Hey, here's my strings XML file. I'm just going to put it in." So actually, usually that part, especially if you're going through the console, would usually be like a business analyst and not necessarily the developer that might do that. So, but the thing that you have to know as a developer is to know as you're writing the code, you have to make sure that you make all of those things extracted so that they can be translated, right? So, it's our job as a developer to put it in here as like our string purchase toast canceled instead of just the string canceled, right? That's the part that we have to do. Does that make sense? the actual translation can be done by somebody else, but you have to, as you're writing the code, make sure that you make it so it can be translated. And so that part becomes the fact of making sure that it can be translated is the job of every developer on the team. Whereas, yeah, it may just be one or two people that do the actual work of interacting with the translators, whether it be one developer, one business analyst, whatever it may be. Okay. Another quick note. We talked about how to change the language in the application. There is actually another way to change the language on most Android devices as well. So if I go into the order screen, if I have the soft keyboard up, the soft keyboard actually has a button to change the language. At least most keyboards do. Not every keyboard has this. But like the built-in one here does. You see the little globe icon on here? I'll go ahead and click that. And that will bring up this. So I can actually change my keyboard, say, into a different language. So I can actually switch my keyboard on the fly there from one language to another. And so with some keyboards, that change is just going to change it from between the languages that you've set up previously. Other keyboards, this actually does go into the operating system, like I think Hacker's keyboard does actually change the language of the whole system. So you can do it potentially through there. If I look at and go into here, there's also a button to get into here and kind of change some of the settings that we've seen earlier. So that's worth to note as you're trying your app, especially on the Samsung tablet. Do kind of check those things. Seeing what happens if you change does changing the language through the keyboard break anything? Because sometimes that can be a problem area. The other thing. What was the other thing? Oh, the other note I wanted to make was just that, as I'm grading these, I generally don't grade them, just so you know, as a percentage that you got correct. I don't usually say, okay, you have 90% of your strings translated, so I'll give you 90% of the credit. Okay, there's a reason for that. And the reason is when you're talking to, if you talk to users and they're speaking a foreign language, right? Let's say you translate 90% of the screen, and then there's a 10% of the screen that doesn't get translated, right? How would you feel if, say, 90% of it is in Spanish and 10% is in 90% of it is in English and 10% of it is, say, in Japanese? How would you feel about that app?
Probably not put together too well.
Probably not put together too well. In fact, it's not uncommon for your users, say, that 10% may be a really important 10%. And that may be enough for your app to get a 1-star review because that 10% hasn't been translated. Right? So, the way I typically grade the translation portion of this for, your labs and tests going forward and things like that is I usually don't take it as a percentage that you've translated, but I take it off for every mistranslation. So I usually say, well, every case where I find that it's strictly in English, I'm going to take off 5 points for that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Because it matters more. It really matters that it is 100% translated, not 90% translated. Right? 90% translated is generally not good enough. Okay?
Yep.
So just as you're doing this, pay really, really close attention to the details, because I will be paying really close attention to the details as I'm grading it. So that also means, the flip side of that means also this: if you're building a smaller app, it's going to be easier to translate and get full credit on that. I'm going to say that offhand, because there's fewer places where you can make a mistake if you're having a smaller app. Okay, so good reason to kind of keep your apps constrained, not make them too huge, right? Keep them something that you can do and do well.
And you did say you wanted us to keep the items themselves, not translate.
Yes. No, this is perfectly fine. You don't want to translate the data here, because that's going to be coming from the database. So it's something that we'll need to solve later on, if we're going to look at it. That's okay. This stuff here, the name and the description of the product, that's fine. That's still in English. I'm okay with that. It depends. So Troy, it depends in terms of the recycler view. So most generally speaking, if it's in the recycler view, yes, most of the time. The thing is, though, it really depends on where the data's coming from. So if it would be data that you would put into a database, right? If you're eventually going to put it into the database, absolutely, you don't need to worry about translating that. So if you have a course catalog and that's got courses in it, you don't need to translate the name and description of those courses or things like that. If you've got job postings, you don't need to translate the actual, like, the name of the job and the job description. But if it's something that's built in and baked into the app where you know it ahead of time, so for instance, in the case of this drop down, it says personal, work, or other. Well, that doesn't change, right? There's no way that would not be coming from a database. That's a fixed set of options that should be translated. Does that make sense? So if it's something that you would hard code into the app, it's never going to change, you know exactly what it's going to be, absolutely go use this system to translate it. But if it's something that's going to be coming from a database, then you don't need to. So that means, again, most cases with Recycler View, that's probably going to be the case, that it's coming from a database. But there are some times where you may have maybe a small amount of, here's the fixed number of choices that you might be showing in a Recycler View, that then you do want to use that system with. So if there's any doubt, just message me and we can talk through it. But yeah, most of the time, if it's in a Recycler View, that's going to be the case, but not necessarily all the time.
Just a side question for the translating. Do you want us to translate it to Spanish?
Mm-hmm.
Like every time, always Spanish? No extra languages or anything like?
I think what I said. What you're asking?
Like if I wanted to say try it in German or something.
Go for it.
Would that matter, or does it are you grading it based on Spanish?
So I did say on the lesson 5 worksheet, I did ask specifically for Spanish on the worksheet.
Okay, so it'll say on the worksheet.
Yeah. If the worksheet or the test says translate into whatever language you want, then translate it into whatever language you want. More than likely, though, I'm going to just say Spanish on the assignments that I give, simply because, hey, we're in the U.S. and those are the kind of the two dominant languages.
Okay.
So I'm not going to take off points if you translate it into German, but I am looking for that Spanish translation, if that makes sense. So honestly, if you translate it into German, I'm probably not going to look at the German translation.
Okay.
So. Okay. So that's in terms of translations. The one last topic for today is just to go through a little bit of theory. And this actually comes from because 5.3 is the chapter, the lab where they ask you to do these translations, which ironically is actually not in the chapter. But one of the things that 5.3 talks about as well is how to adapt things to different screen sizes, which is one of those things that comes up when you are translating in another language. When this goes into Spanish, it's very common for me to find that the text takes up more space. So I'm going to have to make sure that my layouts are fluid and that can adapt to that. The size of this button is now different because of the text that is there. The size of this label, total partial, is longer because of the text that's there, right? So in order to make sure that you can work with different languages, you have to make sure that your layouts are flexible. You don't want to be hard coding in a lot of widths to say, oh, it has to be 100 dp or it has to be 50 dp or such, where you can avoid it, because that will then cause you problems when you translate it. Everybody with me there? And that's also where I've done things like I've stacked the label on top of the field instead of to the left of the field, because like this used to be email and now you can see it's much longer, right? So if I had stuck the label over here on the right, then now my whole layout would have to change, because now I only have this much space to work with, right? I don't have enough space. If I were to keep the spinner the same size, I don't have enough space to actually type in the email. Does that make sense? So you got to kind of think about how you're going to scale the app to different screen size to the text and such. So let me link this article on talking about how to deal with different screen sizes and tools that you have. A lot of the stuff we've kind of already touched on. And by the way, this is on your one of the documents on Perusal, one of the reading assignments on Perusal. So I want to just talk through a few points. Android devices, as they say, do come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. So whatever layout you come up with needs to be flexible. So you want to make sure that one of the common things that people kind of started with going back, 90s, a lot of people designed their websites or their applications. They would go into, say, Photoshop or whatever the program of the day was. You'd go into Photoshop and say, let me design and lay out exactly how I want everything. And then here, take this, hand it to a web designer or an application designer. Like, here, I want you to make this exactly as it shows in the picture, right? Problem with that is if you're designing the UI in Photoshop and then you're having that expectations of pixel perfect, you end up with a layout that is in a design that is very rigid, right? It doesn't scale to different screen sizes. Does that follow?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where a lot of this comes out of, is that people historically have tried to design their UIs in Photoshop. Photoshop is not a good tool for designing UIs. Let me just say that out front. Like, it is not a good tool for designing any UI, and you should avoid that. You should avoid making UI designs in Photoshop, because you will be disappointed how they turn out. Because it's not a good platform to think about, how things should size to different screen sizes. That's why I give you different tools like Balsamiq. Balsamiq, because of its very nature, it's easier to come up with something in Balsamiq that's like, okay, I'm okay with the fact that this is not exactly how it's going to look like. And so it's not going to be the exact same size in the final product as it is in Balsamiq. Does that make sense? Versus if I lay things out in Balsamiq, a lot of people say, well, that oftentimes you get in a situation where you say, okay, well, I want this to be 200 pixels tall. And so that looked fine when I was laying it out in Photoshop or my image editor, but it doesn't look fine on a screen that has a very high resolution and such. So you want to make sure that your designs are kind of flexible in that sense. It can scale, and it can scale gracefully, whether it's the difference in the screen density or the screen resolution or the screen size, orientation, all those kind of things. Another thing that you want to be, another reason you want to do this is there's a feature in Android nowadays, and I don't know that honestly a lot of people use it, but there is a multi-window mode on some devices. I don't know that the emulator here has it, but you can, on some devices, you can kind of split the screen in part and say, well, I'm going to run an app in this half of the screen and another app over side by side to it. Usually doesn't get used very much on smartphones, but it's a little bit more feasible on, say, a 10-inch tablet because half of that 10-inch tablet is much more usable than it would be, say, on a phone. So, you want that to be, flexible so it can it can just automatically switch and use the right layout for that, which usually ends up being, a phone layout basically on the left and a phone layout version of the other app on the right. Okay. So there's a few tools here and techniques for supporting different dimensions in terms of the view and the layout. We talked a little bit about how to use alternative resources for different screen configurations. And another thing that they mention is using bitmaps that can really scale. Because sometimes you do need to use images for a few different things. That's much less of a need. This third thing, I would say using the material components is much better than using these tools. But this is something that's been around for a long time in Android. And if you have, from a designer perspective, maybe you have your graphic designer says, hey, I really want the buttons to look like this. This is one of the tools you want to know about, is how to do some styling, stretching with that. They do mention here, there are a lot of other form factors where you may need to do additional things. So, for instance, Android Wear, if you're supporting smartwatches, TVs, auto, Chrome OS, there's additional things that you have to do specific to those form factors to make your application work. So these tools don't cover that space of things. There is a link here, design guidelines for building different screens. They say, hey, see the material guidelines for responsive UI. I tried to click on this. I got a 4 of 4. So I don't know if this article that they're linking to on the material design in terms of responsive still exists. I don't know what the story is there, but that link is broken, unfortunately. So in terms of creating a flexible layout, the biggest thing I can suggest to you to use is to use Constraint Layout. And we've really already been doing that. Every app that we've built, that's just the layout we started with. We started with Constraint Layout and built from there. And I've tried to really stress on, yes, you want to use Constraint Layout because it gives you that flexibility. A lot of the flexibility that you need comes with starting with that layout rather than starting with some of the older layouts, which we used to use primarily. Linear layout was the most common one, and then secondarily responsive layout. So, go back just a few years, just 5 years, the thing that people used to do the entire layout with was linear layout, and that may seem obscene. That may seem weird, but yes, we used to do our entire thing oftentimes with just the linear layouts nested inside of each other. So sometimes we'd have horizontal ones and vertical ones, but we used to do the whole layout, a lot of the layout with just that one tool. Constraint layout, the way it's set up though, actually does a lot better about making those things flexible, and making it in such a way that you don't have to like nest a layout inside of a layout and inside of a layout, which is one of those things that you always had to do with linear layout, is you'd always have to nest things inside of each other. So you can see their kind of example of how they've got those things laid out, where there's the different constraints in there. And so, really that's the main go-to if you want to make a dynamic layout. Like constraint layout is your biggest tool that you want to use for that. They do mention here, hey, if you have dynamically loaded lists, what should you use? Well, you should use Recycler View there. So Recycler View is also one of those tools as well. Big note here they say is you should always avoid hard coding layout sizes. So that means things like avoid hard coding things as, say, 100 dp or 200 dp or 50 dp or whatever that number is, or avoid having large margins. Like I'd say here they have a 56 margin here between this and that. Those are the kind of things you want to avoid, because that tends to lead to a layout that is less flexible than it could be. So generally speaking, anytime you have your sizes, namely your widths and heights, there's some special values that you want to use. So for instance, match parent. Match parent says extend it to the full width or the full height. Wrap content just says it can be as big as what it needs to be. So if the text needs 50 dp of width, there'll be 50 dp. If it needs 100 dp of width, there'll be 100 dp. So usually you want to use those two values, match parent and in wrap content, traditionally as much as you can. It's worth noting here, and they finally make a note at the end of the section, hey, with constraint layout, you shouldn't actually use match parent. With constraint layout, you should actually be using 0dp, which remember is short for, is a special value for match constraints. So a lot of that flexibility, regardless of what layout manager you use, comes from how you set the widths and heights. Everybody with me so far? Again, a lot of this should be review, but I wanted to just do a rehash on it. So if we say we have the text view, here it's match parent for the width, wrap content for the height. You can kind of see how it lays out differently from this screen to that screen. Here it's the full screen width, and it's much tall. There's more lines here than there are there. It's a taller height there than it is here because that wrap content changes. Also, other things that you might consider, we've talked about this already, is using some layout variants or alternate layouts. So, this layout might be great for a phone, but you may need to change it and adapt it a little bit for a tablet. So, for instance, here they have the kind of three bar to bring a pullout in there. So, you have effectively common two different screens, or you have maybe this part of that slides something in when you click on it, versus here on the tablet it might just always be expanded because you have enough space to leave it expanded all the time. So those are things that you can do and you should at least consider. We talked about how to create those alternate layouts, and one of the things, if you create a tablet variant, usually that tablet variant will have this qualifier in here, smallest width 600 dp. So that one, the smallest width is based on as it says, the smallest width of the screen. So is it, let's say you have if if you have a phone, usually the smallest width is going to be horizontally, right? Because you usually keep your phone portrait mode, so it would be in portrait, it would be the width, versus in let's say you have your tablet's usually used in landscape. That smallest width in landscape is going to be the height and not the width. So it kind of switches between, well, which of those two dimensions is the smaller, so it's independent of whether it's landscape or portrait. So you can use that and say, okay, well, we use one layout for smaller devices, and we'll use another layout for tablets, right? So you could just do that with two variants there. They have some examples of different devices. I will say that these are a little bit dated, but you can at least learn a little bit, learn some things from them. Hey, we've got your typical smartphone sits around 320 dp. You've got a larger screen phone sitting at 480. It's still a phone, about 5 inches, it says. And then you get up to tablet range. Okay, so tablets are around 600 dp. Right? Again, remember this is the smallest width here. What they're talking about, versus like a 720. A 720 would be like a 10-inch phone. Again, this being the smallest width. There would be more difference here if we're looking at the largest width. So if you kind of look at all of those devices that are on the market, generally what you're going to find, and it's not really clear from, I will say it's not really clear from this diagram, but the way it actually falls out is it's roughly every 300 dp, and I think I mentioned this in a previous lesson. But roughly every 300 dp is where I would make the delineation between what size of device it is. Is everybody with me there?
Yep.
So devices that are less than 600, basically those are phones. Devices that are greater than 600, that is where the tablets start. And then you can have, if you're looking at, rather than the smallest width, if you're looking at the width, then you can also consider, is it in portrait or landscape mode? So you can say, okay, well 600 on a let's say you're looking at a smartphone, it's roughly 300 dp by 600 dp ish. It actually turns out that sometimes the height of that, if you turn it into landscape, that does become closer to 600. So you also got buckets in there where it can cross from one level of that to another step higher if you switch it to landscape. So I would say your 0 to 600 is one bucket, and you can kind of think of that as your smartphones. 600 up is generally, I would say, tablets, but you oftentimes want to do something different from your default to 600 to 900 to 1200 to 1600. I would do, what's that right? 1200 to 1500. So usually you'd want to do, if you're going to break it down by increments, the best way to kind of break it down is by steps of 300. Which, if you remember what we did with the recycler view on the first screen, you'll remember that we created a bunch of these different dimens files at different steps. So dimens at the default, at 600, at 900, you could add another one for 1200 and 1500 for larger devices. Right? So that's how I would generally break that up. We also kind of mentioned that, hey, you can use this dimens file. This is a very helpful tool. Oftentimes using this dimens file can remove the need for necessarily creating another layout. Is everybody with me there? Oftentimes, if you just put the value that you need to change into a dimens like this, then you generally don't need to create another layout. Usually that can be good enough. So I would definitely try the dimens before you go necessarily creating another layout unless you can see, okay, well, the controls are actually in a different place. So like maybe they're on top and in one version, and the labels are on top or the labels are on the side. Well, then, that would necessitate a different view. Like what we did with the last hands-on test wasn't something you could just do with the events file, but it's something to consider. In terms of different qualifiers, so you can use the smallest width, which is the default one it creates if you say create a new tablet variant. The other way to handle it is to actually create the file yourself, and instead of using smallest width, it may actually sometimes be better to use width 600. And one of the reasons that this is helpful, usually if you go down this route, you're going to find that you end up needing to create 4 different layouts, been my experience. Usually if I start with this and I say I have a phone and a tablet, I usually end up needing to also create landscape variants of that. So creating it this way usually results in needing a total of 4 layouts. Versus if I just say width 600 or more, I can usually get away with just having 2 layouts there. Got it?
Yeah, it can really get out of control,
Yeah. So, you definitely want to consider it's well worth the effort to think and play around with it a bit, usually to have as few layout variants as you can, because layout variants are very expensive to maintain. Every change you make, you typically have to make it in all of the variants in the end. So if you can reduce the number of variants, you can make it a lot easier to keep the app up to date and to add features to it. So I would say, use this as much as you can. Use minimum width 600 dp instead of smallest width 600 dp, because otherwise you usually end up here. It's also worth noting is another way that you can sometimes do things in terms of adapting to different screen sizes is by breaking your components into fragments, which, as I've kind of said, is almost like mini activities. This isn't something I'm going to talk about here in this course because it's a much more complicated subject and a much more complicated thing to do in terms of being able to support things and that. But sometimes that is the route that people go. Is they say, okay, well, maybe I have this 2-pane layout where I want this part to appear on the left and the other thing to appear on the right in terms of tablet, but I want it maybe as 2 screens in a phone. So that would be something like this, right? So they would basically make this section would be a fragment, and this would be a fragment. And so on a tablet, both of those fragments would appear on the same screen, but on a phone, those 2 things would be a separate screen, would be 2 separate screens. So you might think of it, a lot of times this comes up as let's say your email app. Maybe you're in Gmail, and if you're on a tablet, well, this list over here is the list of your emails, or Outlook, this is your list of your emails, and then what appears over here is the email that you're reading. Versus if I'm doing that on a phone, then I have my list of emails as one screen. I tap on the email, it takes me to the other screen where I can actually read it. So a lot of times that comes up as a way to set things up. I believe this comes what do we call that? Master detail flow is usually this is usually what that's referred to as. Which there is a template to start that master detail that you can start an activity that way. But there is a lot of gotchas with it, and my past experience with that template is that there's bugs built right into the code that they give you. So that being said, so fragments is one of those things as you go further on. If you're going to do this professionally, definitely read up on that, but it's not something that we're going to do here because it can get very, very complicated. There can be a lot of extra code just to be able to do it that way. Okay? Any questions?
Yeah.
Going back to Android 3.1, there were some other qualifiers that we used to use, large and extra large. All you need to know about that is don't use them anymore. They're highly recommended against today. We used to not have the smallest width and the width qualifiers, so we were forced to use this instead. There's been enough problems with it to just say stay away. If you do need to support devices at 3.1 before 3.1, then yeah, you've got to use it. But my hunch is that you're probably not going to run into anything at less than 3.1 because even Google doesn't support that anymore. One thing though in here that is worth mentioning with the especially when you get into fragments and such, sometimes or other places you may need to use a technique called an alias, where you have, let's say we have two files here. We have main.xml and we have main2panes.xml. Okay, so you've got a single pane version and a two pane version. That may make more sense to actually write and name the files that way. It may actually be clearer to work with that than making them technically as layout variants like we would normally. What you can then do is you can add some additional files. These are alias files, so they're not the real file, but they provide an alias. So here we have layout.xml. Is actually points to it's just got this in here. It's resources item main type layout. So this is basically pointing, okay, if I bring in layout, then it's going to actually bring in main2panes. Or if I bring in this one, this is going to be main2panes. So you can use this to kind of alias. You can alias some of the files to say, okay, well, it's actually, if you ask for main, well, then you're going to get 2 panes on this, So aliasing can be a helpful thing sometimes, even without the large and extra large thing that they're talking about. So finally, there's something in Android called 9-patch bitmaps. This was actually inherited from the world of web development, where we wanted to style our buttons and our fields and make them in such a way that was scalable. I think this actually might have been originated by Flash as an idea. But the idea is that we want to take, you have an image like this that you start with, which is your frame for your button or your field. Usually these are used for text views and buttons, but they can be used for other controls as well. And we would use this as, say, a background. Well, we need to scale it up. If I strictly just scale the image up, take this and scale it up to the size of the control, the size of the widget, that would create a lot of distortion, right? It would be a very blurry image. So what we do instead is we kind of selectively, you can set up these 9-slice images to selectively scale the image in certain places at a different rate than other places. So here we have, basically we say, well, okay, this corner here, right, I want to keep that the same size. I want to keep this corner the same size. I want to keep that corner the same size. I want to keep that corner the same size. But I can say, well, okay, this area in the middle, I can stretch vertically. This area in the middle horizontally, I can stretch that horizontally. So some areas can be stretched horizontally. Some areas can be stretched vertically. And other areas are just fixed, right? So we actually do that in Android. If you're going to set up a 9-sliced image, you kind of put these lines on the outer side, this 1 pixel border that defines how it works. So that means that this part is stretchable, this part's stretchable, and then you've got some additional lines on the right and the bottom that specify where the text can go. So here they're saying, okay, well, here's the part of the image where you can put the text of the button. Everybody with me there? I
find it kind of confusing.
It is confusing. It is a little bit confusing. I think I have one because I was playing around with it here. Oh, no. I didn't actually. I was playing around with it, but I must have removed it. So let me grab one of those because I had that. Oh, I don't have that project pulled down. I don't have that project pulled down and handy. So let's see. Maybe I can't. Oh, yeah. Let me go get that image. The one I was going to use. Go find it. So borrowing an image that I just put it in Discord. Borrowing an image that we're also using for the game that I'm working on is this frame, and you can see it's got kind of an angled corner on the left, those sides, right? So maybe yep.
Do you want us to follow along or just watch?
You can just watch this. I'll give you the finished file when I finish updating it. So you can think about, hey, I want to scale this up and maybe use this as like a background for maybe a text box. So what I would do is I would like drag this in here, and honestly, this used to be, I want to say just drawable. This used to be used most commonly before vector drawables were a thing and before material components were a thing. So it's not used as much anymore because vector assets are just so much better. But it used to be kind of, it's one tool in there, and you may still find that you use this with apps that you maybe work on professionally. So if I need to, it's in red because I have some uppercase characters in there. So I need to refactor and rename this file to be all lowercase. Frame angle cuts. Oh, and I actually need to remove the dashes from there too. So refactor, rename. Okay, so that's the image I'm starting with. And so if I go maybe into, again, you don't need to follow along with this. If I go into content order, go back to the design view here, and let's say I want to use this on the name field. So I'm going to pick name, and I'm going to change the background to use that. So that'll be under all attributes, and so background is going to be this frame angle cuts. There we go. Now I can't see it here in the designer because it's showing up because it's white. I think if I go, there we go. So I can change the theme to no action bar up there, and so you can see the frame. Do you see how that's all stretched out right now?
Yeah.
The edges are not clear, and it's actually being stretched more horizontally than it is vertically, so it's just not coming out well. So what I can do is I can either manually rename the file to have a .9 in it, or I can just go down here, right click, create 9 patch file, and I'm going to go ahead and hit set OK. So it's going to set the name as frame angle cuts.9.png. Okay. Now that's actually going to create 2 copies here. So if you go down that route, then I just have to delete the other one, because even though those have the .9, effectively they're the same file. So you can rename it as just .9, which is what I usually do, or you can do that create 9-patch file option. But yeah, I usually just rename it. So once you get it open, you'd see something like this. You see a view like this. Going back to content order. Yeah. So what I have to do is define where those bounds are. Okay. And you'll notice as I hover over, can you see how things are kind of changing? So it shows me kind of this part. If I'm over here on the left, it'll actually be a little bit different if I'm over on the right. Similarly, it does one thing if I'm on the top and another thing if I'm at the bottom. So what you actually do is you just kind of go to the proper edge and you just kind of drag. So let's say I want to drag down here because I know, oh, it didn't release in the right place. Well, that was interesting. Why is it? There it goes. So, you kind of release and figure out, okay, so this is the part, right? So I've delineated the parts that need to scale. And oftentimes it's helpful to hit show patches here to kind of see how it's doing it. I can also hit show content, it'll show the little blue box inside, but I'll turn that off for now. So show patches there, and I'm going to scale this here. So we're kind of eliminating the angles, right? So now that purple area, that's the part that's going to be scaled both horizontally and vertically. The green parts are only going to be scaled in one direction. Everybody with me there?
Yes.
What's up? Mo, were you trying to say something?
Me? No.
Okay. All right. So that's kind of how you start setting up the 9-patch. And if I just go back, it should already have changed. There we go. So you can see how it's coming up as a nice clear line now rather than a blurry line because I've set up that 9-patch. See that? Because it's scaling the different parts of the image in different ways. And so the reason we call it 9-patch is because it breaks the image into 9 patches. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We used to, the original technique of this in the web development world was actually to break this into 9 separate images rather than using one full image. So this is definitely a lot less work than we used to do. But I can then also set the other edges on the side here, and this bottom and the right is that content. So one of the things you may have seen is that it was going all the way to the edge there with the text. So if I bring this in, it won't let the text go all the way to the edge. It'll kind of constrain it inside of the frame. So file, save all, and so now it should, maybe I need to run it on the app. It should bring the text in a little bit. Oh, but I need to be on the dark theme for this. So where is, I'm going to go to the settings app, settings, nope, not settings, it's display, which of course I'm in Spanish. I should probably go back to English.
Why is the John Doe part, why is that anchored to the left if we got the padding, for lack of better words? Sorry, I just call it padding. Why is it anchored to the left?
Panning is the right word. Panning is the right word. I want to see. I'm trying to get into the dark theme so we can see what it's actually doing on the device. So, okay, so advanced, or no, I want to just go here. Switch. Okay. Let's see if that fixed it. Because I'm wondering if the preview is different than how it actually runs. Okay, so on the app, you see it's actually showing it correctly. It's not previewing it correctly in the designer. Maybe if I close and reopen it. Be re-rendered. Nope.
Yeah, because it should be in the center, right?
Yeah, it should be. There should be some space there. That's what I've done here. It just looks like the designer is not showing it properly. Yeah. So sometimes that's a problem. Sometimes the designer does not show it the same way as the app, as it looks in app, which is what I saw in this case. So that's how you set it up. If you should need a 9-slice image, you just have to give it a suffix of like this. Here you've got .9.png and define the outer edges like so. And so if I go here and show an explorer, I can give you the finished version of that in Discord. Okay. Any questions on that? That's kind of where that comes up.
So it's mostly used for making maybe a more creative interface for forms.
Yeah.
Is that usually how it is?
Yep, that's usually what we use it for buttons and for fields on a form.
Yeah, for most business apps, I can't say that I've seen that before or say it would add much value. For what we probably do as an industry, probably not a whole lot. Maybe if
Paul, I would correct you on that and say you've probably seen it more times than you realize.
Oh, okay. All right. That's exactly why I bring it up.
Yeah.
I understand the use case.
I would say it's more common than most people realize, because I think a lot of people don't realize that this is strictly how fields look like out of the box. So to get more fancy shapes, which I'm sure if you go look through the apps, you'll find a few that have some fancier shapes. Like maybe you have an underline kind of with a lip on the left and the right, all those kind of things. I would expect if you, I suspect if you were to actually go through all the apps you have installed, you would find a good number of them are doing something there where they're making the buttons or the fields look different. All right. Any questions?
No.
Okay. So, you have your lab assignments and you have your reading assignments. The article for today to read is to read through this one, which we kind of walk through a little bit and discuss that one on Perusal, and then to work on translating your apps into Spanish.
Tomorrow's a lab day as well, right?
Tomorrow's a lab day as well. Thursday we'll talk about some more components, namely some material design stuff. So we'll talk about card views, snack bars, and shared element transitions.